Okay, so we know we're the panel also right before lunch, and we're going to try and get us back on track, but there's a lot to cover with China. Very clearly, we can't do it all justice in this short period. But like Bob mentioned, we just came off of ChinaCon, are going to do it again next year, and we learned a lot of really interesting lessons, and it was great to have subject matter experts from so many different fields in one place, because I feel like typically at conferences, if you're at a cyber conference, you talk to the China SMEs, and then they're in their bubble, or if you're in policy, you have your China people and they're in their bubble, but we need to actually get everyone together in one place. So it's great here and with this panel to have people who are experts in their own right in different China-related areas. And so some of the stuff that we covered, stuff that often comes to mind with China, cyber threats, supply chain attacks, propaganda, but there's other things to consider with the China risk that, that you might not immediately think of. So land ownership and sovereignty and how they're structuring their ownership structures to get around regulations and tax loopholes, slave labor, the talent pipeline that they have that's fueling their hacking ecosystem, and are they outpacing us when it comes to exploit development and vulnerabilities and research, and what does that talent transfer look like? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let our panelists briefly introduce themselves and kind of their area of expertise, and then we'll just dive on in.
Thank you, Kristin. Hi, everyone. My name is Eugenio Benincasa. I'm a senior cyber defense researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich, where I focus on China. I've been looking mostly at China's offensive cyber ecosystem through the lenses of its researchers' participation in hacking contests and Western bug bounty programs.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you for the conference organizers for putting this panel together. Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Ng. I'm currently with the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. I have 15 years of experience tracking cyber threats that originate from China. So I like to say I grew up with the APTs, right? And so I've done everything from supporting the US government to different corporations, mostly located in the United States.
Hi, I'm Charity Wright. I'm a threat intelligence consultant at Recorded Future. My career goes back to 2005, working in the US Army and NSA as a Chinese linguist. So China's always been my area of focus. And now I do China strategic intelligence. So big picture, what are their long-term goals and how are they achieving that?
Yeah, and so one of the topics we covered and that we were talking about that I hope you could dive into today, but China's attempt at digital colonialism and their propaganda machine, basically. So how a nation might be using technology or its exports to have control over an area or a nation for societal, political, economic gain. Could you kind of describe the Chinese mindset in that space and how it connects to espionage, propaganda efforts, influence operations, and what you've seen tracking that?
Absolutely. So a few years ago, I started a big research project, and it resulted in a report called China's Digital Colonialism. So first, just to level set, digital colonialism is defined as the use of digital technology for political, economic, and social domination or oppression of a foreign country. So this report, what we looked at is global scale of how China is exporting digital technologies around the world, primarily through their Belt and Road Initiative. Within that initiative, there's a big project called the Digital Silk Road. And the Digital Silk Road is actually a private sector effort from Chinese companies, but with the backing of the state. So, millions or billions of dollars of funding to export digital technologies. They're setting up underwater cables, underground cables, data centers, and they're co-opting literally billions of Internet of Things devices around the world. So essentially what this research discovered and revealed was that through these digital projects around the world, they've established a backbone for the flow of information from those countries, especially security vulnerable nations, into China for purposes of espionage, surveillance, and repression. So that's high level.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting too, because we've talked about how they are getting all the state backing and the footprint that they have globally, but someone at ChinaCon had this really good quote, which I'm going to butcher, but the comparison was, we're always responding, too late retroactively to like a gunshot wound, but you need to actually start looking at loaded guns because at that point it's too late and a shot's been fired. So if you're seeing stuff that is going to be co-opted, it's not a question of if, but when it will be used to the Chinese state's advantage under that party. So how can we as defenders, and maybe Judy in the cyberspace, if what you're seeing around APTs and kind of like their, how they're all laid out and their different backings, how could we be more proactive to defend against that?
I think we have to know our networks, right? So wherever, you also have to know your risk profile. They will follow you and your assets wherever they are, right? So if you think your network is super secure, they're gonna find the little holes in it to be able to poke through to penetrate and access your information. You might think, your assets are safe in the cloud. They also come to the cloud, right? There's a statement, I'm sure everyone has heard, where threat actors live on the land. They come into your network, they use commands, they're not alerting, they're not using, their big tools anymore that fire off all the alerts on the EDR, and all that stuff. And another vector that they love using is edge devices, right? So these are your routers, your VPN devices. It is super important to make sure you're up to date and patched on it, and whatever services you don't need to be internet facing, turn it off. Don't give them a window, don't give them a little hole to poke through, right? And I know sitting up here, it's easier to say, oh, make sure you're up to date in your patches. But that's really important because they run scans daily for things that are vulnerable that they might have a tool for. So it's only a moment in time that they're gonna scan it and it's gonna hit and they're gonna say, oh, I'm gonna take advantage of it right now. They may not want to use they may not want to get into your network, but they can use your network as part of their infrastructure to launch other operations.
Yeah, and so you track a lot of APTs. The Typhoon is your baby bull Typhoon. Can you kind of comment on, I know there's stuff that can't be commented on, but essentially, again, the drive behind it, the evolution you've seen it take over the years and what that might mean, because we also had some policy people at the conference and, the China Select Committee members were talking to us about how they're dealing with this now, but one of the largest struggles is despite being aware of it and everyone having feedback and all the agencies working together, there's also 30 years of policy that needs to be undone and rethought about a more strategic way to approach this Chinese threat. So you can get all the experts in the same room, but it's taking time. And so kind of where do we stand with their advancements and what they're going after?
Absolutely. I think everyone in the past has worked in silos. No one wants to air their dirty laundry out there, but it's the inverse now. It has to be a team sport because you're going to have one optic and whichever partnership you develop are going to have multiple optics. So it's really important to develop threat sharing partnerships and find those in your industry that you're willing to share and have insight or work with specific vendors because it's really important to be able to see the big picture because you just see this, but once someone can put it all together for you, it's surprising like how big the picture actually is. So people get really bored when I say we have to work together. Teamwork is really important for this, so we're calling, tracking APT these days is team sport.
I want to follow up on that too. Since the Digital Silk Road project was established, there's been over 200 documented incidents of Chinese cyber intrusions around the world, and that's just what we know of. 49% of those were conducted by PRC military and government personnel, but 41% were PRC civilians. And all of this to say, so many incidents impacting every industry all over the world means that we have a lot of intelligence to share with each other. So I wanted to emphasize that you're not alone in the fight against this kind of espionage and intrusion and intellectual property theft. So it's best to reach out to industry peers, to the government sector and say, hey, this is what we're seeing, what can you give back?
And that's honestly how we kind of got connected because I was doing some vulnerability research and the discrepancies between the US vulnerability databases and the Chinese vulnerability databases. Then Eugenio just wrote this great paper with Dakota, which we can give links to online, but you've been tracking how they're getting the talent to perform the variety of nation-state attacks, and what that talent pipeline looks like, the hacker development, their internal competitions. Do you want to give us some overview of what that looks like from all your research?
Yeah, of course. So starting from the broader assumption, China has built out what is usually referred to as a hack-for-hire ecosystem that basically allows it to tap into civilian talent and private sector in very much unprecedented ways. This has been described by threat analysts, researchers, think tank reports, and so on and so forth. But what is really at the basis of the very basis of this ecosystem is a very robust talent identification development ecosystem for offensive capabilities that really finds its utmost expression in hacking contests. And my colleague, the Kodakeri analyst of SentinelOne, and I, over the past several months, have analyzed about over 500 competition rounds of competitions in China. And we have really identified what we believe is the most robust hacking contest ecosystem in the world for several reasons. And I will get into that. Just before, we'd like to draw distinctions, because usually hacking contests are seen as one thing, but there is actually, there can be different kinds. So the two most important ones being, one is called capture the flag type of contests, which are simulated challenges in different areas, such as, for example, binary exploitation, reverse engineering. They usually take place on some simulated platforms called cyber ranges that allow to conduct training or these kind of capabilities in a safe and legal environment. And then you have live hacking or exploit contests, and these aim to breach real targets in software products and systems, usually to find critical vulnerabilities in exchange for, so that the vendor can patch it, and in exchange for a reward. So it's basically a monetary incentive to make products more secure. And this really, within China's domestic ecosystem, this really started taking off around the 2010s, early 2010s. And this is a very important day, because if we think about the cyber geopolitical world, there was in 2010 when Stuxnet took place. Then 2013 we had the Snowden leaks. Xi Jinping came into power, and a little bit afraid of looking at these dynamics, and also U.S. talent in this area, claimed that China would become a cyber powerhouse. And while these efforts toward building better talent were very much, in many ways, encouraged and coordinated by the state, it was an effort that grew very much organically from China's hacking community. Just to give you an example, in 2013, there was the first time ever that a Chinese team reached the DEVCON CTF finals. It was this team from Tsinghua University called Blue Lotus. And then since even including this year, we've seen 1 to about 4 Chinese teams reaching the finals every year. And this is important because starting in 2013, starting from this success, that really spearheaded China's domestic ecosystem. They started building, establishing startups in very niche offensive capabilities areas, such as vulnerability scanning, cyber ranges. But they also started establishing capture the flag contests. And these are some of the most prestigious globally. They're much more integrated within the broader offensive ecosystem than they are in the US and Europe. For example, they're integrated into the educational curriculum much better. There are some contests that are tailored to professional areas. So for example, there are some contests that are only for the healthcare sector or only for the law enforcement sector. So very, very specific focus that we do not really see in the West. And these are often state-sponsored as well by intelligence organizations, law enforcement organizations, so they serve as great talent recruitment pipelines. And in one specific case, the Kodakeri and I think that one contest at least was used to target real victim. We don't know who the victim is yet, but we're working on it. But this is regarding CTFs. Then when it comes to exploit contests, we can see a similar story, if not worse in some sense. Like Chinese teams participated, for example, at Pwn2Own, the exploit competition in Vancouver, Canada, that takes place every year in 2014. And they won about 13% of the total prize pool. And only 4 years later, in 2017, they won about 80% of the total prize pool. So they beat everyone else. And this is concerning because this really created, this money went into Chinese vulnerability research labs. They become some of the best in the world. These researchers report most vulnerabilities to Microsoft, Google, Apple. They're really incredible. And we know that these vulnerabilities are also channeled to the governments for consideration for offensive purposes. There is amazing research by Recorded Future on this, for example. We know it's a legal requirement, But we know there are also other subtle ways in which companies collaborate with Chinese intelligence for vulnerabilities. And actually, Kristin and with OODA have written the best piece on this. It's called Sleight of Hand. Really recommend everyone to read it by the Atlantic Council. And just to go full circle about this, it's also interesting to note that with ChinaCon, an analyst noted that how hacking competitions influenced not only the broader ecosystem, but also reflected APT tactics evolution over time when it comes to known vulnerabilities or even 0 days.
And I think this is a really interesting mix, especially for the people in the room. If you've got gov, you've got private sector. But obviously, the US and China operate very differently, democracy versus autocracies. And they have their strengths. They say go execute and are clearly on a long-term plan to successfully execute what they're doing. So kind of how we can potentially counter it, we obviously can't roll things out in the same manner, nor do we want to, but I think we have the option to be a bit more creative and on the fly with our responses. So, you know, I noticed one of the sponsors was like the US Cyber Games. Like, there is hope still in terms of like training our talent pool and getting, you know, the resources better. But where do you see, with the last few minutes that we have on the panel, what is the most pressing concern to you, and what glimmer of hope would you leave the audience with how it's going to be resolved? Charity.
Oh man, that's a tough one. I'm torn between global influence operations and intellectual property theft. When it comes to monetary consequences, intellectual property theft, I think, is a greater threat. But when it comes to politics, global leadership, just some research I did last week revealed China's #1 in diplomatic power in the world right now. And that is in part because of vaccine diplomacy, Belt and Road Initiative projects around the world, things like that. But they're also using those opportunities to instill Chinese state media in those recipient countries, therefore, you know, creating a direct flow of propaganda into those countries. We're a little bit more resilient to that in the United States and in the West, especially Five Eyes countries. But I am very concerned around the narratives that they're spreading, which is clearly anti-NATO, anti-US, anti-democracy.
Building on what Charity mentioned, I think establishing norms are really important, right? I think everyone in this room hopefully has heard about Bolt Typhoon, right? There should be no reason why a China-based cyber operator is on a local, you know, state or municipality water network, right? There is no intelligence value there, right? So there's no intellectual property or anything. So we would assess that they're there to, you know, prepare for, you know, one day to be able to cause damage or be able to stop the water flow or to mess with, you know, the fluoride levels of something, right? So exactly. So establishing norms of calling them out, which I know the Five Eyes countries and beyond have established, but continuing to keep up that drumbeat is super important.
Yeah, I'm building on Judy's comments. As China is becoming bolder in its offensive activities, I think it is likely that also its defensive capabilities will go up. We've seen recently in the last few years, China's moving away, for example, from US vendors to adopt its own products and solutions locally, starting with state institutions, that moving to critical infrastructure, and then other parts of society within a policy that is usually referred to as Delete America. And I believe this is also reflected in hacking contests. We see more Chinese targets being included in their own hacking contests, which I think is interesting. So I think moving forward, this might translate into China's having higher defense capabilities, at least strategically. Whether that will actually limits, increases defense practically, we will see.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And with that, we're at time for lunch. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.